Life often provides forks in the road where you got to make a decision. We've seen it in cartoons even that where a character comes traveling down a path and then there's a fork in the road. You go to the left or the right. Well, we have choices in life. Choices really each every day. A fork in the road. Are we going to, and I just say, this fork in the road, there is implications to the decisions that we make. Because we can either do what pleases God or please ourselves. That's what this fork in the road is today, as we're continuing on two paths to choose from. That there's a choice. Am I going to obey the Lord, or am I going to do what I think is right? Am I going to be wise in my own eyes, or am I going to obey the Lord? Because we've seen that warning in Proverbs 3, 5, 6, and 7. That's we're to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not unto your own understanding. And it continues on as it talks about, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn from evil. And so we have choices to make. Are we going to trust the Lord? Are we going to do what pleases Him? Or what pleases ourselves? And so this morning, we're going to see in verse 7, you can either be wise or foolish with your finances the Lord has given. There is that fork in the road, a choice of two paths, wisdom or foolishness. Proverbs 22:7, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave. I mean, just a few verses ago, you were told in verse 2, the rich and the poor have a common bond, the Lord is maker of them all. Means that everyone is made in the image of God. He has made everyone. Just as Genesis 1:27 tells you, God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him, male and female, He created them. So everyone has that in common. Everyone. Everyone has been born in this world, has brought nothing into this world. And everyone who will leave this world will take nothing with them. People have tried to take things with them. They may have a favorite object put into their casket. And that's really more, maybe the family just puts something in there because they want to honor that person or remember them by. But the reality is it just stays in that casket. You know, you can people can try to be buried with all their stuff. But it just stays in the ground. It doesn't go with them into the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians and other cultures have buried their pharaohs with stuff, thinking they'll need it. Even burying people with them because it served them in the afterlife. But it doesn't work that way. I think of the story of the man who had 3 friends that he wanted them to put money into his casket for him so he could take it with him. So he each gave them $10,000. And so time comes and for the friends to put the money in. Well, the one attempted to buy it and used money to buy some stuff and gives some away and throws the rest in. The second one spends even more of it and puts it in there. And they're talking about it after the service, about what they did. And the third guy says, man, you guys, I can't believe you. Man, I put a check in there for the full amount. You can't take it with you. Doesn't matter if the friends put the cash in there or a check. They're worthless to a dead person. Can't cash it. Can't take the cash and use it. Even though Egyptians and other cultures believed that you needed money for passageway in the afterlife, even the Greeks and Romans, the river Styx, you had to pay. I forget what his name was, but he'd be on the ferry. You had to pay him. It doesn't work that way. You can't take anything with you. And so you'll leave it all behind. We have that in common. Everyone's dependent upon God for their lives. He's created all things. He rules over all. And then also God's not a respecter of persons. We saw what that meant from this verse, and see that we shouldn't be either. Deuteronomy 10:17, for the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God who does not show partiality nor take a bribe. Even James, when we were a few weeks ago in that passage we looked at James that talked about that the church was showing favoritism of the rich over the poor. And so we learn that we have that all in common. But now we're told a difference. We're told how we're different. Verse 2 told us how we're the same. Verse 7 tells us how we're different. We're told that the rich rule over the poor. And what does that mean? Well, think about and consider, who are those who are generally in power? Generally in power. Even today, even in our own government. Because we don't have a king where one family who amasses all this wealth, like over in England, even though they're more of a figurehead in England rather than having a lot of power, they still amass a lot of wealth passed down through the generation. We don't have that. We don't have the kings of ancient times where the son succeeded them in a line. And then sometimes it would be that family would be wiped out and a new ruler replace them and take over that wealth. We don't have that type of thing. We have people that can run for Congress and be voted for, whether they're poor or rich. But we actually see that even in our own government, even though those who are poor can run, it's usually the wealthy that are mainly in power. And that power could be used for bad or good. It could be used to serve and be generous and be wise, or to be cruel and oppressive. I mean, Solomon was the richest man who ever lived, but he used his wisdom to serve the people of Israel. He didn't always follow his own advice, but generally, he used it to serve the people. Generally, just as his father did, serve the people. A king had great authority and power back then, that their word was the law. But at times, governments can be oppressive. They can use their power, they can use their wealth. In our own Congress, the majority of people are millionaires. The majority are millionaires, while less than 10% of the U.S. population are millionaires. There's a great disparity. I think the last number I saw was, if we want to be exact, was like 8.8% of the United States population. So you have probably 35 million people millionaires. And including in that would be billionaires into that number. I think it's less than 1 are actually billionaires. But then you have a majority of Congress who are millionaires. You have a lot of people who are millionaires who are governors, or even billionaires, and mayors and such. And it's the wealthy that influence the laws. They send the lobbyists to serve their special interest. They hire former congressmen. There's actually a law that you have to wait a couple years after you leave Congress to become a lobbyist. So now they go and try twist laws in the favor of those who are paying them. And so that's one of the ways that the rich rule over the poor. Another way is through debt, especially if someone's cruel and keeps people in debt. Because it says the borrower becomes a lender's slave. This verse, second half of this verse, is warning against debt. Earlier, the book of Proverbs warned you about becoming responsible for another person's debt, meaning don't co-sign a loan for a person. Even went to the point that you need to hate doing that. Don't do it. Proverbs 11:15 is one of those verses. He who is guarantor for a stranger will surely suffer for it, but he who hates being a guarantor is secure. And it's not just a stranger it's warned about, it's just anyone, even your neighbor. There's other, because that's not the only verse that warns against co-signing. But now the book of Proverbs warns about getting into debt. Why does the book of Proverbs warn about getting into debt when the Bible doesn't forbid borrowing or lending money to people for interest, except in the case of those who are poor? I mean, you see, the God said he would bless Israel if they obey him, and they would actually be lenders to the other nations. But if they didn't obey him, they would be in debt. And they would be borrowing from the nations. But then also God and the Mosaic Law regulated that where they can lend at business. They can lend money and get interest. And so the Bible doesn't condemn that practice except for charging interest to someone who's poor. Loaning money to a poor person to buy necessities like food and clothing and what they needed was to be an act of mercy and compassion. Exodus 22:25. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you are not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest. Today there would be a big difference between loaning somebody money to be able to buy what they need, necessities like food and clothing, or a place to put a roof over their heads. In some cases, a vehicle, to get them to work. Versus a TV, for example, a luxury item. Big difference between those things. But especially when food and clothing, it's supposed to be an act of mercy and compassion. Exodus 22:25 said, if you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you are not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest. That was forbidden. And the reality is the book of Proverbs and the Bible teaches to give and to be generous to the poor rather than loan money. It goes a step beyond that. Rather than just loaning it, give it. Proverbs 28:27, he who gives to the poor will never want or lack, but he who shuts his eye will have many curses. But you know what was going on? The wealthy Jews were loaning money to their poorer brothers and sisters in the book of Nehemiah and caused them to have to sell themselves to Gentile nations, which were forbidden. Nehemiah 5:3-5. There were others who said, we are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our houses that we might get grain because of the famine. And there were those who said, we have borrowed money for the king's taxes on our fields and our vineyards. Now our flesh is like the flesh of our brothers, and our children like their children. Yet behold, we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters are forced into bondage already. And we are helpless because our fields and vineyards belong to others. And Nehemiah went after the Jews, richer Jews who were doing that to their brothers and sisters. Got them in this bad situation. Took advantage of a famine took advantage of those who fallen on hard times and could not survive that, while they could because they had lots. The Bible condemned that. And so look at verse 7 again. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower becomes the lender's slaves. The reality is, getting a debt is becoming a slave to the person you borrow from. That's why there's a warning. Even though the Bible didn't condemn loans and charging interest for loans except for the poor, there's still a warning. The Bible, just because it says that you can lend and borrow, does not mean one should just be careless and carefree. Because the reality is, getting a debt is becoming a slave to the person you borrow from. And the picture of this might be an allusion to the practice of a person selling themselves to pay off their debts. Like an indentured servitude. Indentured servitude has been around for thousands of years. But in the case of this, they would be a indentured servant or slave, we would say, for 6 years. Because Deuteronomy 15:12, if your kinsman, a Hebrew man or woman, is sold to you, then he shall serve you 6 years, but in the 7th year shall set him free. But then also they would send them out not empty-handed. But what it would be if somebody fell in hard times, got in a debt, they could sell themselves to somebody who's wealthy for 6 years. That person would pay off that other person's debts, the person they sold them to. And so then they would get them they would get labor and work. And that person would get food, be fed, and have a roof over their heads. In the 7th year they'd be set free, but they would be sent out with food as well and other stuff. They wouldn't go out empty-handed. And so they worked and paid off their debt. But the reality of any kind of debt is it can become a slave. Because why? Because you can't retire until that's paid off. Even if it's a house. Most people do not have the money laying around to buy a house. It's hard enough to save what they want for down payment. And as well as with cars going up, where cars now, 20, 30 grand, some vehicles like 100 grand, trucks. It's getting ridiculous. But even for things like that, you're still in a sense a slave, because you have to keep working. The work to pay that off. And the more money you borrow, the longer you have to work. And the more you have to make. So it's always best to limit what we borrow. And especially in the area of credit cards. And the worst is payday loans, which have higher interest rates than credit cards. And the reality is, the further you get in debt, it really limits you from being generous and giving to others. Because Proverbs 11:25 says, the generous man will be prosperous, and he who waters will himself be watered. Generous man. And debt limits you from putting treasure into heaven. Matthew 6:20-21, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be also. So, and by putting treasure in heaven means we support the local church we're part of. In this case here, limits to when we hear of needs. It limits when we hear of missionaries and projects. There's projects all the time. We're always receiving mail. It limits those things. Especially because interest, you always pay back more. Way more. I mean, they get you, at least now they let you know how much you'll pay off on these credit cards. But you always pay way back more Even with a house, I think you could pay up to double, triple. It's a shame you didn't have the cash. And so we ought to be careful and limit what we borrow. And so we got to be wise and think about, is things necessary? And there are times when we can, hard times, when things happen. But throughout life, we need to be careful. And then we come to another fork in the road, another choice. Not only of one of be wise with our finances, limit our debts, because I'm assuming that we're going to be paying back. Because I believe it's in the Psalms, it says that the wicked borrow and do not repay. I think that's in the Psalms. The wicked borrow and do not repay. And so there are people who are like that rack up debt and who are wicked, who have no intention of paying it ever back. So I'm making the assumption that we are going to be paying things back, and so that's why we need to be wise. But we come to the next fork in the road is either show compassion or cruelty. That's our choice. Compassion or generosity, we say, or cruelty. Because Proverbs 22:8 says, he who sows iniquity will reap vanity, and the rod of his fury will perish. This verse is about you reap what you sow. Because that's all throughout the Bible. Galatians 6:7-8 says, do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. For the one who sows his flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And that verse as well is one about reaping what you sow. Proverbs 26:27, he who digs a pit will fall in it, and he who rolls a stone will come back upon him. You reap what you sow. That's what the Bible teaches. And it also mentions the rod of the fury will perish. Abused power will not last. That is what's meant by the rod of his fury will perish. They will not rule forever. Often people get tired of them and remove them from power. Either vote them out in our cases, or in other places they stage a coup. And so people who abuse power will often get what's coming to them. You reap what you sow. But then it also says, sow iniquity will reap vanity. When you commit acts of sin, you do not gain what you think you will. That word for vanity is not the word that we often encounter, especially in Ecclesiastes, the vanity of vanities, where it's a word that means meaningless. It's here like a vapor. It's just gone. There's nothing. It's like your breath on a cold day. It's here and gone. That there's nothing substantial. That's not the word that's being used here. This word is describing trouble, sorrow. The trouble and sorrow, not just any trouble and sorrow, but trouble and sorrow that comes from wickedness. It's a sorrow of wickedness. It's a trouble of wickedness. That's why Job 4:8 says, according to what I've seen, those who plow iniquity and those who sow trouble harvest it. You reap what you sow. We see that principle all the time. If we'll have gardens soon. May will be for us as planting. Before we know it, it's going to be May. And we're going to be planting different things. We'll be having flowers in a garden. We'll be putting flower baskets up. We're going to have tomatoes and peppers, and some people plant corn, and I know my neighbor does. The plants, you see the stalks of corn, and he has sunflowers, lots of sunflowers and other stuff. All kinds of fruits and vegetables we can think of that are in the garden. But if I plant a tomato seed, or if you go and buy the plant already when it's small, I expect what that label is to be a tomato plant. I expect there to be tomatoes on it. No matter what kind of tomato it is, there's going to be a tomato on it. I don't expect to go out and find corn on there or peppers. If you plant an apple tree, you don't expect to find cherries or pears. Whatever you sow, whatever you plant, that's what you get. And you always get more. And so in this case, you sow wickedness, you reap the sorrow of wickedness. And how can a person sow or plant wickedness? How does a person do that? It's by committing acts of sin and evil. Lying, for example, pride and anger, those are common sins. Delighting to do evil and harm to others, delighting in sin. It's not these great big acts of murder, but just things that we think of lying and pride and anger. And being harsh in our responses and being mean, delighting in sin. And so come time, there's a harvest. A sorrow of wickedness is his harvest, of diseases and destruction and troubles. A mind no longer bothered by sin. We say it, a seared conscience. No longer bothers them. That's why some people could be in a courtroom and get up and thank the investigators. I'm not even making that up, because I've used that before, where this person got up and just took, instead of showing any remorse or sorrow, they thanked the investigators for doing such a great job of catching them, after all these years. Show no remorse, because they have a seared conscience, because they did not listen to conscience and destroyed it. And then there's the worst of all, is eternal death. Death describing what their afterlife is going to be. One that's in hell and the lake of fire forever. One that is going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth, eternal darkness, a lake of fire, and other descriptions to go along with it. And why? Just as Clark says, the crop must be according to the seed. If a man sows thistle seed, is it likely he shall reap wheat? If he sows the flesh, shall he not of the flesh reap destruction? If you sow sin, you will reap the sorrow of sin. But that also means, if we flip it around, because you can also take the reverse application in Scripture. That would mean if you sow righteousness, then you'll reap the blessings of godliness. Galatians 6:7-10. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever man sows, this he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. So then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are the household of the faith. So what does it mean to sow righteousness? How do we sow righteousness? How do we plant righteousness? Well, confessing and forsaking sin. Delighting to do good. Obeying the Lord. Telling the truth. Being patient. Being humble, being kind and gracious with our words. Having a soft answer in the midst of anger, of when somebody else is angry. Those are examples. And reading God's Word. And what do you harvest? What comes at harvest time for sowing righteousness? Well, a conscience that's tender towards God and His Word. of life that is blessed by God and used by God. Eternal life, a life that is going to be with God forever. This is a life that is blessed. A life that is seen, a life that what you have sown and what you will harvest. Look at verse 9. Because this continues that the principle of the godly person reaps what they sow. He who is generous will be blessed, for he who gives some of his food to the poor. The KJV translates it this way, along with some other translations. He that hath a bountiful eye shall be blessed, for he giveth of his bread to the poor. Speaks of a generous eye. That's what a bountiful eye is, a generous eye. We talk about people being stingy. But this person has an eye that is generous. It's generous towards others who are in need. They see a need, they're asked, and they're helpful. Proverbs 19:17. The one who is gracious to a poor man lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his good deed. Did you know that God will not let you be more generous than he is? It says God will repay, meaning God will bless. This doesn't mean always God will give back in the form of money, or God will always give more to you in that you gave, but God can bless in other ways. And God will bless you. And he's more generous. So it doesn't always mean he'll give you back more money. He can. And he does. But he will also be more generous in other blessings too. And there are times when he does. I've personally experienced God paying me back sometimes even more money than I gave out. He gives me that more money, I should say, is what I'm trying to say. Experienced him giving back more money than when I gave. And other times he's blessed in other ways. But I think of this story of how God was way more generous than this pastor. This comes out of the same series of books that I used the illustration last week. One morning in a New England village, a poor man asked his pastor for money. The pastor asked his wife if they had anything to give the man. "This is all we have," said the wife to her husband. 48 cents. "Well, have faith in God," answered the pastor. "He can give us $48 in place of those 48 cents. The pastor was a cheerful giver, so let's see what came about it. About an hour later, a wealthy friend of the pastor who lived quite a distance away called to see him with his servant. They had come to town on business. He stopped at the pastor's house to get something to eat while they visited. But this gentleman noticed while he was eating lunch with them how sad and downcast the pastor's wife seemed. He asked what was wrong, but the lady avoided giving an answer and soon left the room. Then the gentleman asked his friend, the pastor, if they were in need of money, but the pastor only smiled and said nothing. As soon as the gentleman was alone with his servant, he asked him if he had any money with them and how much. They both looked into their wallets to see what they had with them. The gentleman discovered he had $45, and his servant, guess how many he had? 3. He wished very much he could find $2 more in his pocket so he could give the pastor the round sum of $50, but this was all they had with them. Then the gentleman took the $48 and gave them to the pastor, saying, "I am sure, my friend, that you are short of money. I would like to have given you $50, but this is all we have." The pastor was overcome with surprise and joy. He counted out the money on the table and called in his wife. "Look and see how soon God has acted. He did not even wait till the day was past, but through our kind friend here has sent us $48 for the 48 cents we gave to that poor man this morning." Then they told their friend all about it, and he was delighted to find that he had neither more nor less than what was just sufficient to repay the good pastor 100-fold for what he has done so cheerfully, given to the poor man that morning. They thanked and praised God with humble, joyful hearts. So think about how much times greater that was. It wasn't 10, it was 100. But that doesn't mean you will always get 100 times full, 100-fold. But the point of that is that God is generous. I mean, I've heard of people, that they save up money for something, but then they hear a need. Maybe it's a friend in need, a family member in need. Could be a church project. Could be a missionary. Whatever it is, a need of laying treasure in heaven. And they took that money, instead of buying what they wanted, they took that money and gave it. And then God ended up providing. Exactly. I mean, I've heard of people having this stories of saving up for a vehicle. They needed a vehicle desperately and gave that money away. And God actually brought that very vehicle that they were saving up for. Exactly. Even down to the color. And so the truth is that we're to be generous. And you'll be blessed by God. Because if we take the opposite of this verse, the opposite principle, if we switch it, the person who has a stingy eye, they're not blessed. The one that withholds food from the poor is not going to be blessed. They're not going to have a life that's blessed by God. In fact, the Bible speaks of what they have is going to be given to others. That they're actually saving it up for others. Even at times when they extort interest from people. The Proverbs speaks of that. They're storing up for those who actually will be generous. Whether that person is a poor person like that pastor in the story, or a wealthy person who is generous. You don't have to be rich to be generous. It doesn't matter. And a person doesn't have to be poor, or I should say, they don't even have to be rich to be stingy. A poor person can be stingy as well. But a life that's going to be not blessed by God is a person who's stingy and not generous, who doesn't care. When they see somebody in need, they close their heart. Especially when they have the ability to fulfill that need. Because we see in 1 John, he speaks of that. If you see your brother in need, and say, God, basically the equivalent of saying, Godspeed, God be with you. What good does that do? Does that fill up their belly? Does that put clothes on their back? How is the love of God in us when we see someone in need and we have the means and just wish them well on their way when we could have? When we could have been the person that God used. Just like that man in the story that had the servant, and he thought, I'm sure they probably do need money. Because being a friend, he's been around them long enough to be able to know things about them. And he could have just been like, you know what? We only have $48. Let's just not give it to them. But no, he loved his friend and cared for him, and that's a true story. Those are supposed to be true stories in that book. And so we have an opportunity today, a choice to make. A fork in the road. Are we going to live a life that is blessed by God, or are we going to go our own way? There's a choice. Are we going to be wise with our finances? Are we generous with what we have? Or are we going to have a stingy eye and be crooked in our ways? So we have a choice to make. And so we need to make a choice. And that choice needs to be to walk in God's ways. A life that's blessed by God, that one that is sowing godliness and righteousness, and it'll reap righteousness. A person who's sowing wickedness is going to reap the sorrow of wickedness that leads to hell. So there's a greater, it really reveals our heart, because where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. What we love, what we treasure, that is where our heart is. So do we treasure God, or we treasure the things of this world?